Verma assumed office on April 4th, 2023. He brings over 25 years of international experience across senior levels of business, law, diplomacy, and the military. And he is no stranger to the department. During the Obama administration, Deputy Secretary Verma served as the U.S. Ambassador to India, where he led one of the largest U.S. diplomatic missions and championed historic progress in bilateral cooperation on defense, trade, and clean energy with one of our oldest but also challenging friends. He also served as the unofficial dean among those of us who served as ambassadors in the region alongside him. Prior to that, he was Assistant Secretary of State for Legislative Affairs at the department, and he also worked on Capitol Hill as the National Security Advisor to the Senate Majority Leader. Deputy Secretary Verma holds multiple degrees, including a PhD from Georgetown University and a law degree from American University. And I also want to emphasize that so many of the reforms that we have been enacting have been with his guidance, with his blessing, and yes, with his pushing. And we are so grateful to have champions like the Secretary, like Deputy Secretary Verma, giving us the impetus, the drive, the permission, and also the inspiration to make the changes that we've been able to make. Deputy Secretary Verma.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Really, really great to be here. I want to thank the Director General. Thank you to AFSA, Decor, Senior Living Foundation, represented here by Tom, by Angela, by Kyle, for your leadership and for putting this event together each year. As you've already heard, today's event has a special significance because we're celebrating the 59th Annual Foreign Affairs Day and the centennial of the Foreign Service in AFSA. Now, I'm told this means the program will focus on the past 100 years and the way ahead, and I thought this sounded, frankly, awfully ambitious for a one-day program. But then I recalled that most of you can summarize the root causes of a foreign civil war in a 5-paragraph cable with pithy subtitles. So I expect you'll be finished by lunch, which is good because we are fortunate to have our Ambassador to the United Nations, Linda Thomas Greenfield, to be our luncheon speaker, so I'm really grateful for her coming down to join us. Again, I'd like to thank the Director General and her team at GTM, particularly longtime coordinators Shalia Moyer and Shirley Lisenby. It is because of their hard work that the program has now returned to its full form after a long COVID break. So thank you to both Shalia and Shirley. Let me also join the others in congratulating today's award winners and thanking all of you, every person here, for your excellence and for your dedicated service to the United States. I also want to congratulate the 15 Foreign Service officers that were confirmed by the U.S. Senate last night. Something that does not happen enough these days, but Tom and so many others have really worked on this, and we need to get back to regular order in the Senate where our folks get out into the field. As we are highlighting this month, the seeds of today's diplomatic workforce were planted 100 years ago on May 24th. It was on that day that the Rogers Act was signed into law, reforming U.S. diplomacy by establishing a career diplomatic corps based on competitive examination and merit promotion. It is unquestionable that Mr. Rogers' vision for a Foreign Service fit to serve the department's diplomatic purpose was a success. In the intervening 100 years, our team of foreign affairs professionals has grown from 633 Foreign Service officers 100 years ago to a diverse group of almost 80,000 foreign and civil service employees, locally employed staff, eligible family members, the contracted workforce, student interns, and others. Now, there are many moments we could look at when we consider this tremendous 100-year evolution, but I want to focus on just 2 points in time during my remarks. The first is 23 years ago, when Secretary Powell took steps that continue to resonate throughout the organization. Speaking on Foreign Affairs Day in 2001, Secretary Powell announced the decision to change the name of the day's celebration from one focused exclusively on the Foreign Service to a more inclusive Foreign Affairs Day. As Secretary Powell put it, it was time for the department to use this day to, quote, embrace the entire family, everyone who has made a contribution to American diplomacy, everyone who has contributed some way or another to the greatness of this department. Secretary Powell then went on to summarize the organizational challenges for the department at the time. He argued for staffing up the department for a changing world, fighting for resources, engaging better with the Hill, leadership training and a training float, more equity between the different parts of the workforce, equipping the department with the emerging technology of the day. Sounds rather familiar. Indeed, this was the famous speech where Secretary Powell promised that, quote, I want every single employee in the Department of State to have access to the internet on his or her desk. Now, back then the audience cheered. Today, I think it's fair to say, as we look at our inboxes, we might wonder whether this was a good idea. But what really resonates in that speech is how many of the needs then are things we are still working on now. And I don't see that as a fault, but rather a reminder from the past that it is inevitable that an agency tasked with engaging an ever-changing world must itself also be willing to embrace change and to modernize. And as I'll discuss in a few minutes, we are doing just that. Another notable fact about these remarks by Secretary Powell was the day they were delivered, September 10th, 2001. Approximately 10 years before Secretary Powell gave that speech, we were at the end of the Cold War, an inflection point that brought about an era of unilateral American leadership. The department pivoted quickly to engage with the former Soviet states and a changed Russia. I'm sure many of you even worked through those problem sets. By 2001, the strategic thinking Secretary Powell was looking ahead and seeing the department needed to modernize and adapt to this changed world. And then, the day after his speech, the world changed yet again. And it would keep changing in momentous ways for the next 23 years. 9/11, wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the Arab Spring, technological revolution, social media, disinformation, the pandemic, new challenges from Putin, and concerns about China's intent. October 7th, I could go on. But Secretary Powell and his successors still managed to see many of his workforce reforms through. And this department, this workforce, in turn, met the demands of the day every time with resilience, with creativity, and effort that delivered for the American people. One way Secretary Powell's legacy continues to resonate through the department is through our determination to bring new voices into our ranks, including by expanding our fellowship programs. These new offerings include the Colin Powell Leadership Development Program. It's a fitting name and a fitting program to honor the legacy of a dedicated soldier and statesman that fundamentally changed the department through his focus on workforce and organizational leadership. So let's turn to where we are now, the second of two eras I wanted to talk about. Some of you might have been here last year and recall that I spoke at the close of last year's conference. I think I was in the job for about 1 month, and we were in the midst of a crisis in Sudan. The whirlwind that started then has never really stopped. Over the past year or so, I've traveled to over 40 countries and a half dozen states, visiting our overseas and domestic missions and spending time with our workforce. People have been asking me, why are you traveling so much? Isn't your job here in DC? I can assure you I've had plenty of meetings here too. But I also think it's critically important to stay connected to the needs of our workforce, including our terrific locally employed staff. And there's a few reasons for this. As a former ambassador, I know, as will many of you that have worked overseas, how there can sometimes be a disconnect between the field and Washington. We talk a lot about building shared understanding with foreign governments. I think it's important to make sure we have that shared understanding between headquarters and our globally deployed workforce. I also come back from every trip inspired and motivated to do the right thing by our team spread across the globe. What you will find when you travel is that our teams around the world are as committed and dedicated a workforce as you will find, and that includes those that are serving in very dangerous and difficult conditions. At the end of the day, we are a national security agency with people serving bravely from Ukraine to Somalia and South Sudan to Iraq and Port-au-Prince and in so many other conflict zones across the world. I could share many stories of their creativity and effectiveness and heroism, but the main point here is this. In an age of increased competition, of global interconnectedness, of growing authoritarianism, it is vitally important for America's diplomats and development professionals to show up everywhere we can, to lead, to build, to grow, and to deepen cooperation. This mission is so important because, as Secretary Blinken often says, the world does not organize itself. Without U.S. leadership, there are often adverse consequences. And that is why the United States has worked over the generations to build an unrivaled network of global friendships, partnerships, and alliances to work with together towards our common causes. And it is this network that is the United States' greatest strategic asset. And our ability to continue to lead is so important because the world is always changing, including becoming more complex and some would argue less free. And it is on the shoulders of this department to keep that network strong and growing. Our diplomatic mission is also more important than ever as we see more countries competing for more resources with a more fractured international architecture involving renewed great power competition and a wide range of transnational threats. It was in this context, even before Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the attacks of October 7th, or the latest instability in Haiti or parts of Africa, that President Biden suggested the world is at another inflection point, a point where the decisions America makes now at home and abroad will impact generations to come. These decisions, of course, include how we approach our competition with the People's Republic of China or respond to Putin. There are also decisions about how we handle cybersecurity attacks and information warfare, how we push back the continuing threat of extremist groups, how we prepare for the next pandemic, address the impacts of climate change, or integrate artificial intelligence into human endeavor. So, how are we addressing all of these challenges? The first way is by, again, focusing on ensuring the department is fit for diplomatic purpose in this changing world. Under Secretary Blinken's modernization agenda, we are making sure this department continues to adapt, evolve, and lead on the global stage, leveraging the advantages of our diverse society and driven by the promise of a dynamic future. Since the modernization agenda was announced over 2 years ago, major organizational changes have reflected evolving missions, such as the creation of a new China House, launching of the Bureau of Cyberspace and Digital Policy, and the Global Health Security and Diplomacy Bureau, appointing our first Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer, and the launch of the agency's first DEIA strategic plan and major IT reforms. Each of these steps is helping the department to ensure we have the organizational capabilities necessary to address what we see before us today and into the foreseeable future. But of course, we also know that much of what we will face will be unforeseeable. Imagine when Secretary Powell made that great speech 23 years ago, he had no idea how much the world would change the very next day. But the leadership lesson we learned from that speech is just as valid now as it was then. If we want to be able to address the knowns and unknowns, we have to invest in our people. And that's why the workforce reform is the second big prong of the modernization agenda, and a place where we are making tremendous strides. And let me just outline a couple of those areas before I wrap up. Our mantra is that we want to recruit, train, and retain the world's foremost diplomatic corps. We've made incentive structure for the Foreign Service more competitive. We're looking at civil service mobility. We're doing more surveys and feedback from our workforce on recruitment. We are focused on making it easier for the department to win the competition for the kind of talent and diverse talent we need to succeed. As Secretary Blinken has noted, diversity and inclusion makes us stronger, smarter, more creative, and innovative, and gives us significant competitive advantage on the world stage. We're doing more than ever to seize on that advantage. In the last year alone, our 17 diplomats in residence and national recruiters have conducted thousands of in-person career events in all 50 states, as well as Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands, providing guidance and advice to students, professionals, and the community about department careers and student programs. We also launched paid internships, removing financial barriers to allow the brightest students from colleges and universities across our great nation to live and work in Washington, D.C. at U.S. embassies and consulates overseas. We're also excited to be transitioning Foreign Service assessments to virtual platforms. This is in keeping with the trend in the private sector, but also makes application to the Foreign Service more accessible to all. We're trying to go out and find people who ordinarily would not have had a pathway to this department. That means all 50 states, all kinds of backgrounds, all kinds of educational and career experiences. We are expanding our training options, encouraging career-long professional development with new classes, curriculum, flexibility, and finally, yes, that training float that Secretary Powell mentioned 23 years ago. We also have several retention initiatives, but the one I want to highlight is broader than one single program. Rather, it is an organization-wide focus on making sure our ranks at all levels more closely reflect the diversity of our great country. This includes equity, inclusion, and transparency initiatives that are more consistent with our organization's values. We are far from finished leveling the playing field, but these are measurable and important steps forward. So these are just some of the recent progress and successes that we've had, and we are keeping our organization prepared for the tasks ahead. And we are not done. We are asking everyone in the organization for new ideas about where we can improve. And I'd like to ask all of you for your help as well. Yes, your service is not over. We need you to help us to continue to recruit the best and the brightest recruits for our organization. And I'm not just talking about international relations majors. The breadth of our international cooperation is so broad now that our needs include nearly every field of endeavor, from computer scientists working on artificial intelligence to life scientists working on global health security diplomacy. If you know someone interested in a foreign affairs career, send them to careers.state.gov to get more information. If you'll take that one request on board, perhaps all of us, retirees, current employees, fellows, and future employees, might look back on this time, this inflection point, 23 years from now, and decide our organizational introspection was well suited to the time, that we got more right than wrong, and that we worked together to prepare the department as well as we could to be the face of America to a changing world. Thank you so much.